Welcome everyone to the second part of this series on valuation that we're presenting here at Sole First of all, thank you to the organisers. We're very pleased to be able to be here again and present. And when I say here, unfortunately we're not there with you whilst the current situation continues, but hopefully that will resolve very soon. So you've heard in the first part, Luke has given an excellent review of the theory of valuation and using discounted cash flow models to develop NPVs and understand value, as well as using comparables and how that plays into the industry and how the utility of using these models in valuation and other exercises. What we're going to talk about here is some more advanced and detailed concepts around assumptions and building flexibility into those models. We're not going to be able to cover everything here, but I hope that there'll be sufficient information in this to give you an idea of certainly how we at PharmaVentures approach modelling for our clients and how we help them in deal scenarios, and also make you aware of some of the things to look out for and things that you need to understand are limiting in these methodologies. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the background. And you've just heard Luke talk about the theory behind discounted cash flow models and NPVs, and this is a very important point. Discounted cash flow models are theoretically based. They are mathematics, and it says that this is an extremely important consideration. We're looking to the future in this modelling and estimating potential sales, and also applying knowledge and experience from the past to risks associated with achieving those sales and achieving market launches, progression through clinical trials, all of which may or may not come true. So we need to bear that in mind. Not all of the inputs that go into the model are factually based. They are based around assumptions with best knowledge available. But therefore, the quality of the data inputs and the robustness of those assumptions underpin the models, and therefore also present weaknesses and limitations to what models can and should be used for. It's very true that in deal scenarios, certainly in licensing deals and also in some M&A, where assets or companies are not in market or publicly traded, development stage, and assets which have future revenues attached to them, that both sides tend to use NPV modelling as a means of establishing what the future value might be and then bringing that back to a value today. It's net present value, or NPV. You'll see I've got ENPV there, expected net present value. It's the same as RNPV in this context, and they tend to get used interchangeably, those terms. But it's true both sides use. There are other methodologies. There's Monte Carlo simulations. We employ decision tree analysis within our modelling systems as well, but there are other methods of doing it. But the majority of people will use a version of discounted cash flows to look at future value and establish a value for an asset today, and then base deal terms around that. And we're talking a little bit about that in this presentation. Because each side, if in a deal scenario where you're both looking at the same asset, you'll have different experiences and different knowledge bases. There will be differences in the perception of value and what a certain asset might achieve. And when you're in those situations, it's very important to understand and challenge the assumptions that other side are making, as they will challenge yours, in order to arrive at a consensus. One hopes that in both sides producing models, there will be a certain amount of agreement and any differences can be overcome through dialogue. If you're at a starting point where in your valuation you think your asset is worth 50 billion and the other side thinks it's worth 500 million, there's probably going to be an issue in coming together and getting consensus, and clearly assumptions are wide apart, but still worth the dialogue to understand where those differences lie and what your arguments are and their arguments are for those differences. It's true that reliance on one particular methodology, whilst you can, again, weakens the whole circumstance and the whole argument. And using both models, whichever is your favourite format, and real-world data, the comparables that Luke talked about previously, can help validate the assumptions. One would expect you will get an outcome which is aligned from both methodologies if your assumptions are valid and if historic deals actually represent what might happen in the future. You'll often see in people's disclaimers in all forms of life that past performance is no guarantee of future, but it's a pretty good guide in a lot of cases. Luke has covered some of these. Comparables are limited by the closeness to your deal, either how alike your deal they are. Some of the limitations are also that they only represent a minority of deals that are done. And within that minority, not all financial data is disclosed, if any. Therefore, by virtue of that, we're working with a subset of data. So there are weaknesses on both sides, but hopefully there's enough data in both circumstances that will allow you to arrive at a range of values that will give a consensus as to what the NPV for your asset ought to be centering around. Important point here. Remember that published deals financials are not discounted or risk adjusted. So the only bit that kind of isn't is the upfront, because that gets paid on day one, which hopefully is in the same time frame as the calculations. Any future payments, milestones, royalties that you see in press releases, so you'll see company X achieved a deal of $1 billion. Well, that $1 billion and a large proportion of it may be way in the future and may never actually get paid. Similarly, a lot of deal press releases don't include royalty elements, so it's impossible to compare one methodology with another. But there are certain elements of it that you can bring to bear to arrive at, do the NPV look like it's in the right area. So models are a useful tool for establishing value and how it might be shared in a deal. But if you're going to use the models and use them actively in a deal process, you need to build in flexibility into your modelling so that you can make adjustments for what the other side say, for when circumstances change, for propositions that are that are put on the table, and what that means to you in terms of return of value to you, and how much value the other side is taking out of an asset. But they are a tool. We know that there are lots of people do their own modelling, and lots of people go to third parties like Parameventures for their models. When we provide models, we like to actually provide something that you can use and is flexible enough for you to make changes, so that once the work's been done, you can use it actively going forward. And you don't have to keep coming back to us. Others don't do that. They'll give you a PDF with some numbers in it, which is helpful, but not as flexible as might be useful for you in a modelling scenario, in a deal scenario. So let's look at some examples. Here's a theoretical example. It's quite complex. It's actually based around a real-world example, but of course, for confidentiality purposes and others, it has to be anonymised. But a biotech company is developing drugs for non-small cell lung cancer. It has a platform technology, and it's doing that. So here's the background. Late stage, focused on the treatment of cancer, and it in-licenses compounds and developing through to late stage trials and then out-licenses. So a very typical model. Looks to then do the out-licensing to a major pharma and make money. They have a lead candidate. Let's call it EGF-1. It's a novel immunotherapy for non-small cell lung cancer, currently in phase 3, very limited patent protection. So it's obviously had a sort of checkered development history where it's actually made it, but the patent life is running out and it's not going to have a lot of time in market. But the company has a platform technology where it's developing another drug, EGF-2, much earlier, but has very long patent protection. Their strategy for EGF-1 and EGF-2 is to, because it's late stage, commercialize EGF-1 in the licensed territories, Europe, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, no, not the USA, and treat stage 4 patients who are EGFR wild type. and then take EGF2, targeting the same patient population through development, and then commercialize it in USA, China, Japan, and South Korea, so for new markets for that, but also replace EGF1 in the existing market. So there's a crossover because it's a better product with better patent protection. They also have an opportunity with an observation that combining this drug with a TKI in lung cancer actually is beneficial, and they'll do that in all markets. So they've got two opportunities there. So we were asked to provide a valuation of all of those particular applications, and one of the things we'll do early on is look at the clinical landscape of this and where might this drug fit. And the company believed that at the time, and this was a few years ago, that its efficacy would be as good as the checkpoint inhibitors. And therefore, you can look at a scenario like this of, on the left-hand side, non-small cell lung cancer splits into those who are stage 4, which is 70% of them, others 30%, so you're carving out populations already. Of those, 24% are EGFR positive, 4% ALK positive, and then others are EGFR ALK positive. And then you progress through, the ALK positives will get an ALK inhibitor, and then if they relapse on that, could get this drug, either 1 or 2, second line. The EGFR positive patients can get a TKI like gefitinib, erlotinib. Obviously, there's osimertinib now, and some other better TKIs that are out there. And then if they relapse, which all TKI patients do, this is a second line treatment, or first line with the TKI. Then you see the other scenarios there where this could be positioned. And it's important to position the drug because out of that will come the number of patients that work through. And when you're building a bottom up number, you'll need to know the addressable market. What's the total number of patients you're going to be able to address? Therefore, if you apply sales and marketing to these, assuming it makes it through and is as good as they say it's going to be, what proportion of that market you can capture, i.e. your market share, and then how long it'll take you to get there, your peak sales and your sales curves. And Luke showed those different uptake curves of a lot of blockbuster drugs, and they're all quite variable. So when you model them and use one curve, in there is going to be an inherent error. And then you see on the right, we've got two scenarios here. Scenario 1, where we're addressing one patient population. Scenario 2, where we're doing it slightly differently with both potential drugs. One point here, this can be built based on theory, on where it might fit. But in the real world, you may find that actually the picture's a little different. And it's a good practice at this point to say, well, let's go talk to the real world. And we often do this. We'll engage with clinical KOLs around the world and say, if this drug were available, how would you use it? Where would you use it? What proportion of your patients would you use it on? To underpin the diagrams that we have here and say, okay, this is a reasonable assumption. Without it, it's not an unreasonable assumption, but it's just less robust. Obviously, that takes time and money and effort, but it actually gives you a more robust model at the end of the day. So we conduct activities like this, and we'll do it in key territories where drugs are to be marketed. We'll do this as an iterative process. You'll see on the right there how we do this. We build a TPP for the drug. We'll build a questionnaire. We do that with you, the company. We go around and interview some people. We then modify questionnaires if we need to. We then go and interview again. And then we collate all the responses and put those responses into the model. What we aim to get is consensus. So that may take 3 KOLs per territory. It may take 6, 8, 10. It does take time. But you see the key questions there. What are you competing with? How does this vary from different territories? What drives prescribing habits? When are you going to use this? Why not? How does it fit in the whole disease scenario? And from this, you can get actually how much of the drug is likely to be used in what proportion of patients, and this will inform your model. So we go to quite a lot of detail here, and in this particular scenario, these were some of the areas we went to, and you can see the detail in here, how we address different assumptions that are going to feed into the model. So right at the top there, what's the addressable population? So we'll go to incidence data there from GloboCan and other places, and we don't necessarily just use one source, we'll use multiple sources. looking at the population of patients, again, multiple sources there, how many stage 4 cancer patients are. So there's a lot of data out there, a lot of data in available free. There's a lot of data in databases that you have to pay for. So we combine up these sources to arrive at a position which, again, is reasonable, but is also defensible. If the other side has built a model and they say, well, how do you get to your 70% figure? We can point at reputable references which underpin that. So it's hard for them to argue that, well, that number should be different. And that's kind of where you want to get to with your assumptions, is to have a position where if it's challenged, you've got a response to that challenge that says, no, this is how the number arrived at, and therefore it's reasonable to use it. You'll see in there on some situations we use calculations to get to a number, but even that is a reasonable way of doing it, providing the base for the calculations is well understood. Similarly, in revenue calculations, we'll look at various inputs and assumptions. You see it right at the top there, assumption that the sales uptake curve equals the uptake curve of patients. And again, we saw the uptake curves earlier and how they vary. So this actually is a weakness, but it's defensible. We're going to follow the average uptake curve for PD-1 inhibitors because the company believes this will be as good as PD-1. So why wouldn't it be the same as that? And we apply this for other areas. Peak penetration, 50%. So an assumption there will be able to achieve a peak of 50%, and that it will compete with Keytruda, as it says there. And if it's as good as, that's not an unreasonable assumption. How much revenue per patient? Again, we're saying it's average. In some markets it'll be higher, some markets it'll be lower, and we'll take the average position. Again, quite a defensible position. And others through there. Cost of goods is an important input. How much is going to cost to make? And if you've got real data, that's better. If you haven't, it can be calculated based on biotech company estimates. And there's data out there which you can use to determine what your cost of goods may be if you don't yet have a real feel for it. Again, it's kind of like using comparables. Here are other assumptions: what clinical trials are going to cost and how many of them you're going to do. In this case, the company was quite clear, and you'll see this is historic. And I can tell you that the actual drugs didn't launch on this time frame. It didn't play out as they thought. So whilst the model was valid, the actual real world was different. But right there, they've got planned concurrent phase 1, 2, 3 trials going on, which costs a significant amount of money. So in the first year, there's over $11 million worth of trials being run, then 15, then 50, then 46 million. So you've got 120 odd million worth of costs there that actually the company didn't have in hand. So whilst it's a plan and a model, they still have to achieve that and actually achieve those revenues and then prosecute the trials and run them concurrently. And there are all kinds of other influences like regulatory influences, availability of patients and trial sites, approvals from the regulators. Nobody expected a pandemic to occur and stop all clinical trials. So all of these will have influences which can or cannot or may not be anticipated. Luke again talked about attrition rates and how you apply these and risk adjust accordingly. Again, this is some specific data for lung cancer, and you can see there the phase 1, phase 2 attrition rates and survival rates. So 9% lost in phase 1, and overall phase 3 to approval in lung cancer is 10% of assets making. And there you see in the graph on the right some actual trial data. Out of 74 trials in phase 1, 7 failed. In phase 2, 47 failed, 67 passed, and so on and so forth, to determine the attrition. And then applying those attrition rates to the model in that decision tree analysis mode. We mentioned earlier about cost of goods and SG&A, sales, general and admin. These are costs. These have to be factored into the model. They have to be paid for. Cost of goods, we've talked about, it's what it costs to make the drug. SG&A includes all of these other expenses. Again, in a sophisticated, detailed model, you could get numbers for all of these, or, as is done in most cases, you apply a percentage of your revenues as going to be paid out as SG&A. Again, it's a reasonable assumption and everybody does it, but again, it's flawed and lacks subtlety, but it's acceptable. What you can do is look at what other companies' typical cost of goods are and what other companies' typical SG&A rates are, and these are some big pharma ones, and you can get these from their published documents, and use similar figures. So you can see in 2015, the SG&A margin of these typical companies was in the range of 20 to 30% of their revenues, and similarly in the following year. So it always is around that point, and their COGS around the 19-20% mark. So if you're in that area, you're probably in the right ballpark. But as drugs progress through and sell more, the percentage actually, you wouldn't always be spending 30% of your revenues on SG&A. And there's economies of scale that change throughout the lifetime of the drug. You can build that in, and it may make a difference, but it's acceptable maybe just to apply a single number to the calculation. So we have this example here with this biotech, and looking at the two scenarios we said, and we built this into the model so that you can switch between scenario 1 and scenario 2 and change inputs in them, pricing, COGS, SG&A, included territories, excluded territories. But in scenario 1, we have it's approved for first line, stage 4, non-small cell lung cancer, as it says there, no EGFR ALK aberrations, high EGF, and no systemic chemotherapy. So a very clearly defined patient population and similar efficacy to Keytruda. In scenario 2, it's similar, but with PD-1 expression less than 50%. At the time, there was people didn't tend to get prescribed PD-1, PD-L1s if their PD-L1 expression was less than 50%. So it's a kind of a variant on the two populations. It would change the patient numbers, and there you can see what the model actually told us with those assumptions that we've talked about, that their EGF-1 actually would make a loss of 20 million. Their EGF-2 drug, its NPV was at a value of 1.3 billion, and the TKI utility of it would have a value of over $1 billion. So the total value of those, if you sum up those parts, is 2.4 billion. Is the company worth 2.4 billion? Absolutely not. As we said earlier, they've got multiple clinical trials, multiple indications, none of which they have the cash to actually execute. And if you took this out to market and said, I think this company is worth 2.4 billion, people would not believe you. If we change the switch in the model, and our models allow the clients to do that, you get to, if we change the model to scenario 2, we can see the impact of that slight change in patient populations. What you see in scenario 2 is you lose more money with the EGF-1, and one starts to question, why is the company doing that anyway? They're going to lose money. What it may be is there may be a strategic view is actually that this will seed the market, and it's worth losing 20 million to actually then gain $1 billion with EGF-2 and the other utility. Still worth over 2 billion in terms of its NPV theoretically. And again, in real world markets, people would not accept that was the value of the asset and all its applications today, because there's so much that still remains to be done. So looking at a different example, this is actually, you can see the actual spreadsheet here, and on the left-hand side, you see different territories. This was a company that was actually looking to in-license an asset for specific territories, and therefore it was interested in the revenues by different geographies, and also its cost of goods. And you see there, it's phase 1, SG&A is all in there. And in this example, we've included the global launch, every territory included. And you see there, 2021, the revenue line is 400 million. The costs are 75 million, and that then flows down to a contribution into the final revenue line. If we change and exclude some territories like the USA, they didn't launch in the USA, you can now see that the revenue lines changed. They're actually lower, and you can see the impact of including or excluding territories. And when we build these models, we include patient numbers for each territory, revenue lines for each territory, and absolutely what that means in all cases. We also build sensitivity analyses into the modelling when we do them, because you want to know, well, what happens if the price is slightly higher or lower? What happens if I don't get market penetration quite as much as I thought I'd do? What's the impact on my revenue line in this? So in this particular model, again, it's the non-small cell cancer lung model. We were looking at giving the client the ability to say, well, if I got a slightly lower percentage revenue per patient per year, they could decrease that up or down and see what the impact of that was, and similarly see what the impact of all market reduction in penetration into all markets, because maybe it wasn't quite as good as the PD-1s, PD-L1s. So what you can see here in the highlighted boxes is where we have the price that we thought it was going to be and the penetration it was thought it would be, and then you can see up and down from there the impact of either less revenue per patient or more revenue, or greater or lesser penetration into the market. And that's done for both scenario 1 and scenario 2, so you could see how it varied across the different ones. And this allows you, without going into remodeling lots of things, some of the variations on key parameters and what that means in terms of the likely NPV that it will generate. What we also provide in our models, and what can be done with modelling, is to build in a deal calculator, if you like, that uses the revenue figures and the NPV to determine what a possible deal might look like. Again, theoretical, and it's important to remember this is theoretical. So here's an example which sits in one of our models, and what you can see at the top there is the NPV, and you see the split between the licensor and the licensee, and the split there is 3-1. And at the stage this was at, that's not an unreasonable split. And then what we provide there is some boxes below in the model where you can put different inputs in terms of the deal components that you might like to see. You've still got to go and negotiate them, of course. But here we have an upfront of 2 million. We've put a milestone of 2 million when it gets approved, another milestone when the first sale happens, and another milestone when you get certain sales levels, and then some royalty rates you'll see tiered 5%, 7%, and 9%. And some outputs there telling you what percentage is the upfront, what the headline deal size is, and some other parameters there. And then those numbers can be changed, and you can look at the impact on the deal split, because in depending on what stage of development an asset is at, the deal split will vary. At a phase 2 asset, it might be 1-5 in favour of the licensee. At a launched and in market, it may be just a profit share 1-1. At preclinical, it may be 10-1. So you can see by changing those numbers how you affect that deal split. And if you're a biotech that needs cash up front, you put a bigger number in the upfront value. That has quite a big impact on the deal split. If you can wait for the money, you can increase the royalty rates, but you're increasing the uncertainty of you actually getting that money. Big pharma tend to like to push things into royalties and milestones, because if they're not achieved, they don't have to pay them and less money at risk. Small biotechs have a greater need for near-term cash and push the numbers towards the front. And that's where the negotiation comes in, the skill in getting and arguing for money in certain time points. On the right-hand side, now you see what happens if we change some of the numbers. So here, I've said, oh, well, okay, we're a poor biotech, we need cash up front. I've left the milestones the same, but I've increased the upfront to 5 million rather than 2 million, and I've increased the royalties to 8, 10, and 12% rather than 5, 7, and 9. And what you see here, although the NPV hasn't changed, the split changes, and it's now 2-1 in favour of the licensee. which is kind of going to be harder to achieve. The licensee is going to be looking at this saying, well, that's too much value to you, the licensor. I don't want to give you that much. The skill of your negotiation and the competition you have in the process may or may not allow you to achieve that deal split. But what the model does is allow you to see the impact. And if the other side offers something different, you can plug those numbers in and see what the impact is and how much value you're gaining or losing. Again, as we said earlier, it's important to remember not to focus on the headline values and remember all those assumptions that are behind it, which may or may not actually come to pass, and may be defensible and may not. So whilst, again, it's a useful tool, do keep those assumptions and the basis of those assumptions in mind. So hopefully that's given you some insight into the level of sophistication you can build into the models and how you can use them, and with some examples, and also highlighting things to be wary of. So just to make some concluding remarks, discounted cash flow modelling, widely used in the industry as an accepted methodology. It's appropriate to establish the value of an asset, especially individual assets. Other methods exist and are used. Assumptions, and we've said this repeatedly, underpinning the valuation are key to its accuracy and its robustness, and the better assumptions you can make with the more real data behind them, the better your model. Time and effort spent on researching those assumptions gives you a better model and gives you more defensible arguments to uphold the value in your favour when you use the model in negotiating a situation. Models are theoretical and are not definitive, even though they appear to be very precise and accurate and definitive. Use multiple methods, use comparables, use other things to generate value ranges to give yourself confidence and give yourself better robustness and arguments for defending your value. And as Luke said earlier, the numbers are almost certainly wrong, but the skill is to be the least wrong and to be aligned with the other side so that everybody agrees this is reasonable and can base a deal around it. And we'll see later on that in part 3 some examples where they clearly were wrong, but it didn't stop the deal happening. And with that, I thank you for your attention and look forward to part 3 and speaking to you again.